Hey guys, in today's video I want to talk about the technical differences between a classic forehand, a modern forehand, and a next-gen forehand. But not only that, I'm also going to tell you which forehand you should use at the recreational level. So let's start off with the classic forehand, and it starts off with the grip. It used to be hit with a continental grip, even though there were some players that hit it with an Eastern grip as well. But one characteristic of the classic forehand is a take back without a loop. In other words, players like Jimmy Connors or John McEnroe, for example, used to take the racket straight back without a loop. Now, all professional forehands that I have studied, even the classic ones, utilize torso rotation to get power. So even a classic forehand has torso rotation, but is sequenced much differently than a modern forehand, for example, because of the fact that it doesn't have a loop. And here's the reason why. When we take the racket back without a loop, now when we start rotating, we're going to simultaneously go forward with the racket and rotate the torso, which results in a contact that's further back than a modern forehand, for example. It is usually struck with both shoulders parallel to each other, or in some instances, the dominant shoulder might be slightly behind. And the finish on the classic forehand is also much shorter than a modern forehand finish, for example. So the racket usually would stop somewhere around here. Generally, the stroke was overall shorter. It had a shorter backswing, had a contact that was a little bit further behind, but also interestingly had a shorter finish as well. And because the classic forehand stroke was overall shorter, the amount of torso rotation was also significantly less compared to a modern forehand. So players with no loop at all would take the racket back and simultaneously rotate and go forward with the racket, and naturally they would also rotate less towards the finish of the stroke, usually somewhere to about this area. And because of the continental grip and the contact that's slightly further behind, the classic forehand had significantly less topspin than a modern forehand or a next-gen forehand. This has to do with the fact that they used a continental grip or an Eastern grip in some instances, and it is more difficult to generate spin, especially with a continental grip, because the hand is more behind the racket and it is more difficult to go upwards. Now, this doesn't mean that spin was impossible. There was even players back in the day who generated a lot of topspin, but there's no comparison to the amount of topspin that's created on a modern or a next-gen forehand. And also, when the contact is made further behind, topspin is more difficult to achieve, especially the heavy topspin that's seen on today's tour. So with this contact that's further behind, it is definitely more difficult to generate topspin because the body is in a way. Even in a situation where the shoulders are parallel and next to each other, the body is kind of blocking this vertical swing path of the racket. It doesn't mean that it's impossible. Yes, you can still go upwards with the racket, but it's definitely not as easy as it is with a modern or a next-gen forehand. So Bjorn Borg is the father of the modern forehand. He was one of the first players to have a loop on his forehand, and was also one of the first players to have more of a Western grip. He indeed went over towards the Eastern side, and now all modern players have at least an Eastern grip. In fact, the semi-Western grip is the most commonly used grip on the modern forehand, and some players are even further over towards the Western grip. So those two technical elements are by far the most important characteristics of a modern forehand. That is the grip and the fact that players are utilizing a loop. So here's what happens when a loop is present on a forehand. Now the torso rotation can be sequenced differently. So when the racket is going back, it will go up before it goes down. This is a very important technical element of the forehand. The reason why is that now when the racket starts to drop from a high position, we have time to start rotating early. Now compare that to a classic forehand where there was no loop, there was no time to rotate early, and players would simultaneously rotate into the contact. They would go into the forward face right away and also rotate at the same time. And this is not the case on a modern forehand. Because of the loop, players will first take the racket back, and as the racket is dropping, players will start to open up so that when they hit the forward phase, basically when the racket cap is pointing forward, the players will already be significantly open. As a result of that, as they continue to rotate, they will make contact naturally with the dominant shoulder in front of the non-dominant shoulder. So the big advantage of the modern forehand is that at the moment of contact, the dominant shoulder is in front, therefore there's nothing in the way. Players have a wide open space to, as they continue to rotate, to swing in a circular fashion up, across, and back. In addition to that, with the modern grips, the hand is more underneath the racket, making topspin easier as well. The amount of torso rotation on a modern forehand is significantly more compared to a classic forehand. So when we start the rotation early, we are also more likely to continue to rotate well after contact. You can see that on modern forehand, players have a rotation that finishes with the chest towards the side fence. So the modern forehand compared to a classic forehand is a stroke that's significantly longer. It is loopier and therefore also generating more swing momentum. As the racket drops from a higher place, it naturally will pick up more speed compared to a take back where you're taking the racket straight back. What about the next gen forehand? Yes, it is slightly different from the modern forehand. When we look at young players such as Carlos Alcaraz, Yannick Sinner, Lorenzo Musetti, or even some of the players that have been around a little bit longer, such as Thiem, Kyrgios, Zverev, or Shapovalov, they do hit the forehand a little bit different. So the difference is in the starting position of the racket. So the tip of the racket will point forward as they go into their looping action. So all the components of the modern forehand are still there, but one thing that all these players have in common is that the racket is slightly pointed forward. And now what will happen as a result of that, and you can try this out at home, if you take your racket in the starting position in a more forward way, now as you take your racket back, the racket will be more towards the outside. So take a look from this angle. If I have my tip of the racket forward, naturally as I take my racket back, the racket will be more towards the side. Now naturally, as the racket drops, the racket will start turning towards this side and eventually go into a lag position. When we compare the next gen forehand to more of a modern forehand, the difference is that the classic modern forehand, such as Federer or Nadal at certain portions of his career, or Kei Nishikori, have a vertical position of the racket as the racket is going back. So they don't put the racket forward, they have the racket going straight up. And naturally, as the racket drops, it is less likely to go this way. This will require a turn of the wrist and is less likely to happen. Take a look from this angle. As my racket is more vertical, when I take it back, it is going to drop in this way. And compare this to a next gen forehand. If I have the tip of the racket going forward, as I take my racket back, naturally the racket will be more pointing straight towards the side fence. Now, interestingly, Nadal has experimented with this type of backswing at certain portions of his career, but then reverted back to his regular way of taking the racket back. But the interesting thing about the next gen forehand is that players in the past have used this style as well. Andy Murray, for example, has also a position of the racket head that's more forward, and then naturally, as Murray takes his racket back, the racket is more pointing towards the side. Also, Andy Roddick had a slight forward position of the racket on his take back, and as he dropped the racket was also going more towards the side. And now if we go way back, we had a player called Jim Courier. Not sure if you remember him, but he was #1 in the world. He also had a next gen type forehand way back in the day. Jim used to have this racket completely pointing forward, and as he took it back, he achieved the same position as the next gen players do. So does having the racket like this change the forehand at all? I do think it makes a little bit of a difference. Overall, when I look at the next gen players, they all look whippy to me. And I'm not saying all of them. There's a few next gen players like Tsitsipas or Alex de Minaur who have a little bit more of the modern forehand characteristics. But generally, the vast majority of the next gen players has this type of style. And what I think happens a lot of times with the whippy type forehands is that they're a little bit less consistent than the classic modern forehand. Now the movements are happening with the wrist, because take a look. If I have my racket tip pointing forward and I take my racket back, I obviously have to move my racket from this position into this position. So there's quite a big movement. That's why it looks more whippy when you see these players play on TV. And I think what happens that if we compare these forehands at the elite level, so that's a very important distinction that I want you to understand. There's absolutely nothing wrong with these forehands. In fact, these are some of the best forehands in the world. But let's compare these forehands to the best forehands in history, which in my opinion are Nadal, Djokovic, and Federer. In my opinion, the next gen forehands are not as consistent as those three guys. And the main reason for the lack of consistency is that there's a little bit more movement with the racket and there's more chance of the forehand going wrong. And I'm not the only one saying this. There was a really fascinating podcast with 4 legends. It was Mats Wilander, Boris Becker, John McEnroe, and Ivan Lendl. They were talking about the next gen players. And one of the things that they all agreed on was that generally the next gen players are a little bit less consistent than players in the past. And Bjorn Borg, as the father of the modern forehand, was one of the first players to put heavy topspin on his forehands. And this tradition has continued, and the next gen players are utilizing a lot of spin. Players like Berrettini or Kyrgios have a tremendous amount of spin. So the swing path has become very vertical. In other words, when we look at the contact shortly thereafter, the racket is going more vertically across the body in this way. And if you think about it, it overall suits this type of style of forehand. When we have more movement back here, we might also have more movement in the front of the stroke. It complements the stroke as a whole, having a lot of movement back here and then having also a lot of movement in the front. But again, a lot of movement here might also mean that there's going to be some inconsistencies involved in a stroke as well. In my opinion, the best 3 forehands, as I previously stated, are Federer, Nadal, and Djokovic. And these guys also have a lot of spin on their forehands, but overall, those forehands look a little bit cleaner to me. So if we take Djokovic, for example, it is overall a cleaner stroke with less movement. When that's the case, less things can go wrong. So which forehand should you be learning at the recreational level? Personally, I allow my players to develop their own backswing. So if you have a backswing like the next gen guys do and have the tip of the racket more forward and then resulting in a more sideways position before the racket begins to drop, if you can pull this off, then by all means continue doing so. But in my experience, I don't think you should even worry about the backswing, because the number one problem at the recreational level when it comes to the forehand is the contact that's made with the dominant shoulder behind. Now in extreme cases, take a look at your local club, players will be severely behind with the dominant shoulder. And then as we get to a more advanced recreational level, 4.5 and even 5.0 in some instances, players will still make contact with the dominant shoulder behind. And that is the number one problem at the recreational level, and that's a problem that doesn't exist at the high level. So if you want to have any chance to get better as a tennis player, this is what you have to fix. You don't worry about the backswing, you got to start making contact out front. Now that doesn't mean that you're going to start straightening your arm and doing all these corrective techniques. You're going to have to start making contact with the dominant shoulder in front. Now if you want to know in great detail how to do this, check out my video titled The Kinetic Chain. And what about the high level? When I'm coaching high level players, I let them develop their take back intuitively, and if it happens to be the next gen take back, I don't necessarily have a problem with that. If we take myself as an example, I am not comfortable taking my racket back like this. This adds too much movement back here and I start becoming very inconsistent. So for me personally, someone that have a modern forehand for a long time, I'm more comfortable with a more traditional way to take the racket back, with the tip of the racket more straight up as it goes back. So at the high level, I don't want you to worry about your backswing too much and let it happen naturally. And at the recreational level, I only want you to start worrying about how you're taking your racket back if you're making proper contact with the ball.